Hello. Today we'll see the last part of a short story written by James Joyce, an Irish writer that was a very influential artist in the modernist age. He was born in Ireland, but he left his country, was forced to leave his country, and spent time in Italy, in France, and in Switzerland, where he died. When he was in Ireland, his first collection of short stories, Dubliners, was a scandal. First of all, because there was a detailed reference to names of streets or pubs, people who really lived there. And this was uncommon. Many people felt offended by a reference to their business activity. This is because in his stories he describes not the best of the Irish people. He describes characters with very unattractive human behaviors, like abuse, prostitution, gambling, drunkenness, and so on. Not only, but his attitude towards the English was not very respectful, and this was not good taste. But this is just his style. He rejected the conventional good taste that was typical of the other writers of his period, because this was his way to be modern. Among the themes that characterize Dubliners, there's the theme of paralysis and of death. Joyce said, "I call this series Dubliners to betray the soul of that paralysis which many consider a city." So Dublin, for Joyce, is a dead city. Why? In his opinion, Joyce believes that there are two forces that contributed to this death of Irish culture: the influence of the Roman Catholic Church and England. Because of these two forces, Ireland has remained behind compared to the other countries in Europe, and is one of the poorest and least developed countries. This is why he was forced to leave, because he wanted to have more challenges and to be accepted for his own ideas. Let's talk about the narrative style, technique of Joyce. On the one hand, he continued the realistic tradition according to which literature was an instrument to promote awareness. And to do so, he had to be an objective observer. But there was also another influence in his period, the one of aestheticism, according to which the job of the artist was not to tell people what to believe, but to make the reader see by themselves things. And so, in a way, the work of the artist should be impersonal. Let the readers construct the meaning of things and images described in the story. And one thing, a typical technique, device used by Joyce in his stories to achieve just that, was the so-called the use of epiphanies. Maybe you may remember the epiphany in the Christian religion is the moment of revelation. In his stories, there are moments when the protagonist has an epiphany, a revelation, things that are normally seen as normal, routine, acquire for a moment a different light, and he can understand something about himself, about life, just in that moment, an epiphany. Another important element about the epiphanies is the use of symbols. You are going to see the use of names. The repetition of some words create symbols. Why a symbol? A symbol is when a name, a word, becomes larger than itself, acquire a different connotation. And also another important thing is the point of view. Most of the story we are going to listen and to analyze will happen inside the head of the protagonist. Part of the story will happen when the perception of one protagonist, one character, Gabriel, will be faced with the perception, the feelings of another person, Greta. And so we will see that Gabriel, who believed to be someone, understands, because of his epiphany, to be somebody completely different. and he tries to understand who he really is. As we said, Dubliner is a collection of short stories. The last one is called The Dead. The storyline of The Dead is built around two important events. One is a party during Christmas at the house of Mrs. Morgan. There's a big party, they have fun. Gabriel has the possibility to show how good he is at using words. And then the second part, the most important one, is when they go back to the hotel room. There's a big change inside himself. After he listens to what happened to an old friend of Greta. The story is narrated in the third person, singular. He's just an observer, he doesn't know everything. Now, let's consider the theme of paralysis that is present in all the short stories of Dublin. This theme of paralysis in The Dead is represented by the story of the horse of Patrick Morgan. The horse worked in a mill, and it spent all its time walking around, moving around mechanism, and so it was used to move around all day instead of going straight. One day, Patrick Morgan took his horse to celebration parade, but while he was going to the parade, the horse saw in one of the main squares a statue of a rider with a horse. By the way, the statue was of the English King William III, who conquered Ireland. So this is ironic. And the horse fell in love with the horse in the statue. And instead of going straight forward towards the parade, he began to turn round and round the statue of William III. And this repetition of the same circular movement is a vivid description of the paralysis of Irish culture. Most of the story is about a party, and we see here Gabriel talking at the end of a meal, of dinner, to all the guests. He's quite a successful speaker. It's very good. He's very happy. At the end of the party, while they are getting ready to leave the house, something happens. There's a lady starts singing a traditional song, and Greta stops, freezes for some time. She cannot move. She's lost in her own world, because that song for her is very important. It reminds her of something that is in her heart. Then they take a carriage to go back to the hotel. Greta is on her own. Gabriel is still happy, and while he is traveling, tells the story of horse, of Morgan, and what happened to the horse when he saw the statue of William. So they arrive at the hotel, and Gabriel is full of himself, and Gabriel is also full of expectation. He imagines a romantic night with his wife, but Greta is somehow different, and so Gabriel wants to know what's happening. Wants to ask very kindly if there is any problem. And Greta says, "Oh, I'm thinking about the song I heard at the party. A song that she connects to a boy she used to know when she was in a village." She tells about this boy. They used to walk together. It was like a boyfriend. And here, Gabriel becomes jealous, because he believes that this boy is still alive and they have a love affair. When she tells the story, you understand that the boy died one winter. He died because of her, because this boy loved her so much that even if he was sick in winter, he went to say goodbye to her because she was going to a convent to study. And this is the end of the conversation between Gabriel and Greta. At this point, everything that happens is inside the mind of Gabriel. The narrative style changes completely. Now, Gabriel begins to reflect about his life, about his role as husband. And he can't understand why he's so overcome by emotions. What happened? Why does he feel like this? It's knowing. And snow is a symbol, because snow is a word that will be repeated many times at the end, is covering all over his country, Ireland. And then he remembers Michael Fury, the boy who was in love with Greta. Now he's no longer present, it's just a shade. He feels himself to be like a shade, not a physical body, just a presence. And then he reflects on the meaning of his life. So, what is life? We are all going to die. Day after day, we're going to die with age. He understands that Marco Fiori really loved Greta because he risked his life for this woman. And this must be love. And this is something he has never experienced before towards any woman. Snow continues to fall, and the last words of the short story are, snow is falling upon all the living and the dead. So there is a connection between those who continue to live and those who are dead, as we're going to see. Now let's listen to the reading of the last part of The Dead.
Greta, dear, what are you thinking about? She did not answer, nor yield wholly to his arm. He said again softly, "Tell me what it is, Greta. I think I know what is the matter. Do I know?" She did not answer at once. Then she said in an outburst of tears, "Oh, I am thinking about that song, The Lass of Aughrim." She broke loose from him and ran to the bed and, throwing her arms across the bed rail, hid her face. Gabriel stood stock still for a moment in astonishment and then followed her. As he passed in the way of the cheval glass, he caught sight of himself in full length, his broad, well-filled shirt-front, the face whose expression always puzzled him when he saw it in a mirror, and his glimmering, gilt-rimmed eyeglasses. He halted a few paces from her and said, "What about the song? Why does that make you cry?" She raised her head from her arms and dried her eyes with the back of her hand like a child. A kinder note than he had intended went into his voice. "Why, Greta?" he asked. "I am thinking about a person long ago who used to sing that song." "And who was the person long ago?" asked Gabriel, smiling. "It was a person I used to know in Galway when I was living with my grandmother," she said. The smile passed away from Gabriel's face. A dull anger began to gather again at the back of his mind, and the dull fires of his lust began to glow angrily in his veins. "Someone you were in love with?" he asked ironically. "It was a young boy I used to know," she answered, "named Michael Fury. He used to sing that song, The Lass of Aughrim. He was very delicate." Gabriel was silent. He did not wish her to think that he was interested in this delicate boy. "I can see him so plainly," she said after a moment. "Such eyes as he had, big dark eyes, and such an expression in them. An expression." "Oh, then you were in love with him," said Gabriel. "I used to go out walking with him," she said, "when I was in Galway." A thought flew across Gabriel's mind. "Perhaps that was why you wanted to go to Galway with that Ivors girl," he said coldly. She looked at him and asked in surprise, "What for?" Her eyes made Gabriel feel awkward. He shrugged his shoulders and said, "How do I know? To see him, perhaps." She looked away from him along the shaft of light towards the window in silence. "He is dead," she said at length. "He died when he was only 17. Isn't it a terrible thing to die so young?"
When Greta tells Gabriel of a person who was very dear to her, Gabriel begins to feel a pang of jealousy. He becomes jealous because he understands that the heart of his wife, full of the love for another person. And Greta described this boy, Michael Fury, who was a very delicate person. He had a beautiful voice, but he could not fulfill his dream to become a singer because he had a problem and he died of consumption, tuberculosis. We have to follow the changes in Gabriel. First of all, he was curious. He wanted to know why Greta was so inside herself. Then he became jealous. But then, when Greta says, this boy is dead, he died when he was only 17, then he wants to know more, he wants to understand. And Greta tells him about this boy.
What was he? Asked Gabriel, still ironically. He was in the gasworks, she said. Gabriel felt humiliated by the failure of his irony and by the evocation of this figure from the dead, a boy in the gasworks. While he had been full of memories of their secret life together, full of tenderness and joy and desire, she had been comparing him in her mind with another. A shameful consciousness of his own person assailed him. He saw himself as a ludicrous figure, acting as a penny boy for his aunts, a nervous, well-meaning sentimentalist, orating to vulgarians and idealizing his own clownish lusts, the pitiable, fatuous fellow he had caught a glimpse of in the mirror. Instinctively he turned his back more to the light, lest she might see the shame that burned upon his forehead. He tried to keep up his tone of cold interrogation, but his voice when he spoke was humble and indifferent. "I suppose you are in love with this Michael Fury, Greta," he said. "I was great with him at that time," she said. Her voice was veiled and sad. Gabriel, feeling now how vain it would be to try to lead her whither he had purposed, caressed one of her hands and said also sadly, "And what did he die of so young, Greta? Consumption, was it?" "I think he died for me," she answered.
And when Greta described the simplicity, the innocence of this boy, but the power of his emotions, for his feelings for her, he compares himself. Who is he? He calls himself a ludicrous figure, just a person who believes to be an important one, but in the end is just a nobody, one who really has no real experience of life, and he feels humiliated. And then Greta says, "I think he died for me."
A vague terror seized Gabriel at this answer, as if at that hour when he had hoped to triumph, some impalpable and vindictive being was coming against him, gathering forces against him in its vague world. But he shook himself free of it with an effort of reason and continued to caress her hand. He did not question her again, for he felt that she would tell him of herself. Her hand was warm and moist. It did not respond to his touch, but he continued to caress it just as he had caressed her first letter to him that spring morning. "It was in the winter," she said, "about the beginning of the winter, when I was going to leave my grandmother's and come up here to the convent. And he was ill at the time in his lodgings in Galway, and wouldn't be let out, and his people in Oughterard were written to. He was in decline, they said, or something like that. I never knew rightly." She paused for a moment and sighed. "Poor fellow," she said. "He was very fond of me, and he was such a gentle boy. We used to go out together, walking, Gabriel, like the way they do in the country. He was going to study singing, only for his health. He had a very good voice, poor Michael Fury." "Well, and then?" asked Gabriel. "And then, when it came time for me to leave Galway and come up to the convent, he was much worse, and I wouldn't be let see him, so I wrote him a letter saying I was going up to Dublin and would be back in the summer, and hoping he would be better then." She paused for a moment to get her voice under control, and then went on. "Then, the night before I left, I was in my grandmother's house in Nuns Island, packing up, and I heard gravel thrown up against the window. The window was so wet I couldn't see, so I ran downstairs as I was and slipped out the back into the garden, and there was the poor fellow at the end of the garden shivering." "And did you not tell him to go back?" asked Gabriel. "I implored of him to go home at once, and told him he would get his death in the rain, but he said he did not want to live. I can see his eyes as well. He was standing at the end of the wall where there was a tree." "And did he go home?" asked Gabriel. "Yes, he went home. And when I was only a week in the convent he died and was buried in Oughterard, where his people came from. Oh, the day I heard that he was dead!" She stopped, choking with sobs, and, overcome by emotion, flung herself face downward on the bed, sobbing in the quilt. Gabriel held her hand for a moment longer, irresolutely, and then, shy of intruding on her grief, let it fall gently, and walked quietly to the window.
And Greta tells how one winter evening she was about to leave his village, and there was Michael Fiori who came to see her at her house, and he was shivering because he had fever, he was sick. Asked him to go back home, and did so. After she says, "Oh, the day I heard that he was dead," her emotions are so strong she cannot continue with the story, and she is choked with sobs. She is overcome by emotion and starts crying, lying on the bed. What can Gabriel do? Well, he just keeps her hand is close to her, and then he goes to the wind.
She was fast asleep. Gabriel, leaning on his elbow, looked for a few moments unresentfully on her tangled hair and half-open mouth, listening to her deep-drawn breath. So she had had that romance in her life. A man had died for her sake. It hardly pained him now to think how poor a part he, her husband, had played in her life. He watched her while she slept, as though he and she had never lived together as man and wife. His curious eyes rested long upon her face and on her hair, and as he thought of what she must have been then, in that time of her first girlish beauty, a strange, friendly pity for her entered his soul. He did not like to say even to himself that her face was no longer beautiful, but he knew that it was no longer the face for which Michael Fiori had braved death.
After some time, Greta is asleep, and Gabriel looks at her. Now, I understand that it is not any longer as beautiful as she was when Michael Fiori was alive. She shows her age, but a man had died for her. And so he compares what Michael Fiori felt for this woman and how his feeling for his wife have been. He understands that in the life of his wife he has played a very little part.
Perhaps she had not told him all the story. His eyes moved to the chair over which she had thrown some of her clothes. A petticoat string dangled to the floor. One boot stood upright, its upper fallen down. The fellow of it lay upon its side. He wondered at his riot of emotions of an hour before. From what had it proceeded? From his aunt's supper, from his own foolish speech, from the wine and dancing, the merry-making when saying good-night in the hall, the pleasure of the walk along the river in the snow. Poor Aunt Julia! She too would soon be a shade, with the shade of Patrick Morkan and his horse. He had caught that haggard look upon her face for a moment when she was singing Arrayed for the Bridal. Soon, perhaps, he would be sitting in that same drawing-room, dressed in black, his silk hat on his knees. The blinds would be drawn down, and Aunt Kate would be sitting beside him, crying and blowing her nose, and telling him how Julia had died. He would cast about in his mind for some words that might console her, and would find only lame and useless ones. Yes, that would happen very soon.
He doesn't know why he feels so upset now. Maybe, the drink he had at the party, maybe the dancing, and then he remembers his Aunt Julia, who was quite old, and soon she will be another shade. She, like Patrick Morgan, is this person of the past, and his horse. Soon he will be at her side when she's dead. Soon she will be dead, yes, as we all are going to be soon. At this point the room becomes colder, and then there's a reflection about death. We are all going to die. We're all going to become shades. But, thinking of Michael Fiori, it's better to die boldly, courageously into the other world, in the full glory of love, of a strong passion, than fade, disappear day after day with age, become old without never having experienced a very intense, a true feeling.
The air of the room chilled his shoulders. He stretched himself cautiously along under the sheets and lay down beside his wife. One by one they were all becoming shades. Better pass boldly into that other world in the full glory of some passion than fade and wither dismally with age. He thought of how she who lay beside him had locked in her heart for so many years that image of her lover's eyes when he told her that he did not wish to live. Generous tears filled Gabriel's eyes. He had never felt like that himself towards any woman, but he knew that such a feeling must be love. The tears gathered more thickly in his eyes, and in the partial darkness he imagined he saw the form of a young man standing under a dripping tree. Other forms were near. His soul had approached that region where dwell the vast hosts of the dead. He was conscious of, but could not apprehend, their wayward and flickering existence. His own identity was fading out into a grey, impalpable world. The solid world itself, which these dead had one time reared and lived in, was dissolving and dwindling. A few light taps upon the pane made him turn to the window. It had begun to snow again. He watched sleepily the flakes, silver and dark, falling obliquely against the lamplight. The time had come for him to set out on his journey westward. Yes, the newspapers were right. Snow was general all over Ireland. It was falling on every part of the dark central plain, on the treeless hills, falling softly upon the bog of Allen, and, farther westward, slowly falling into the dark, mutinous Shannon waves. It was falling, too, upon every part of the lonely churchyard on the hill where Michael Fiori lay buried. It lay thickly drifted on the crooked crosses and headstones, on the spears of the little gate, on the barren thorns. His soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe, and faintly falling, like the descent of their last end, upon all the living and the dead.
Initially he was jealous, then compassionate, and now he's really sad. He starts crying. I understand that that feeling, what passed between Michael Fiori and Greta, must have been love. And then he watches outside the window, and he sees, in the evening, dark is approaching, and he sees shades, forms, and his soul comes closer to the world of the dead, to the shades of the past. He can feel that existence, not tangible, not solid, is flickering. Now there's no longer. It's very weak, and his own identity is, almost disappears into that world for a moment. Here there is the last part. Now the intensity is such that Joyce uses a poetical language to convey all the complexity of his feeling. How can we say this is poetical? First of all, because in poetry, the form is as important as the content. The form is the content, and the rhythm that shows the words is part of the message. So here you can see there are some words, for example, snow, repeated many times. So snow is no longer a noun, is a symbol. Snow is cold, it's white. You can think of snow as a symbol of death, but also, you know that after snow, there's no months. There is a spring, there's a regeneration of nature. And notice how, falling softly, softly falling. This is a typical device used to create a rhythm, a variation on the theme of falling. And this, at the end of this description of the snow falling softly, softly falling over island, there is that the snow connects the living and the dead. What is the meaning of this? You can interpret it in many ways. First of all, there is end, so living and dead, in a way, they are connected, because in Ireland, according to Joy, people are not really alive. They are like Gabriel. They are not experiencing something true and intense like Michael Fiori had the possibility, wanted, had the chance to have. In Ireland, things are now routine, the repetition of traditions, of conventions, and there's no movement, no life. So in a way, the living and the dead are connected. But there's also a possible, positive ending of the story, because there's the possibility of regeneration. Let's see a few more things about the analysis of this short story. As you have noticed, especially in the last part, there is the so-called free indirect discourse. We have what happens in the mind of the character, is what is called stream of consciousness. This is a mental process. So when we think, we don't use punctuation, we just have ideas, words, one after the other. Flow. How can we describe, represent this flow, this stream of consciousness? One technique is the so-called interior monologue. That is, we speak inside ourselves. And there are different ways to represent, there are different ways to use an interior monologue. What we see at the end of the dead is a form of free indirect discourse. Let's consider, for example, here. Before, between Gabriel and Greta, there was a normal conversation. But now, Greta is asleep, so there's only Gabriel. Notice here, Gabriel, leaning on his elbow, looked for a few moments, and so on. So, this is observation. So, she had had that romance in her life. This is a thought. It's not an observation, it's a thought inside the mind of Gabriel. It hardly pains him now. So, this is what he feels inside himself. He watched her while she slept, an observation of what Gabriel is doing. He did not like to say even to himself that her face was no longer beautiful. This is a free indirect dialogue. Imagine this in a more traditional way. He thought of it, and he said to himself, quotation marks, I don't want to say, not even to me, that her face is no longer beautiful as before. Full stop, quotation marks. You see, here is a continuum idea, observation, third person observation, and the feelings, the thoughts, the ideas that are inside the protagonist are all in the same level. There's no quotation marks punctuation to separate one with the other. There is not even he said, he thought, and so on. It's free. Free means that the narrative is without the conventional forms that characterize a monologue or a dialogue. Symbols. Now, the name Michael Fury, the surname Fury conveys to us the idea of fire, of passion. So, the name Michael Fury is has a symbolical meaning. Not only Michael, because he died in the fury, the passion of Michael was such that he risked his life because of his love. He preferred to die young than to live a long life without any real intense experience, intense passion. Not only, Michael and Gabriel were two archangels. They are messengers. Archangels are messengers. Now, Michael is connected to death, a messenger of death. Gabriel, instead, is a messenger of, he told Mary that she was pregnant with Jesus. So in a way, Gabriel is a messenger of good news. And now we may think again about the end of the story. Because if Gabriel, because of his transformation, is a messenger of good news, the end must be positive. There must be a hope for regeneration at the end of the story. Now, the epiphanies, the revelations, are basically two in the dead. The first one is when Gabriel listens to the story of Michael Fury from his wife. And he understands that his wife was, is quite different from the one he believed to know. And the second one is when Gabriel, after Greta is asleep, abandons himself as a person, as an individual, as a, full of pride, full of himself, and he feels like joining the vast community of the shades of his country, of his past, of his present. And this process is underlined step by step through the interior monologue. So in the end, snow falling faintly falling all over Ireland is death, is winter, absence of life, but can also be, because of what happened inside the hotel room, the possibility for Gabriel to connect at another level with Greta, and to connect again at a deeper level with his own identity and with his own country. Thank you.